Hello everyone, it's Jeff. Making a second video today. I just finished one and I'll be posting that probably tomorrow or the day after, but this one assuming it goes right, I'll post today. This is my first video entry to a sub-contest for the vinyl community on YouTube. And it's by a guy that I follow or that I've subscribed to. I'm one of his 100 subscribers, which is the reason for the contest because he just hit 100. So congratulations on that. It's from Tales from the Crate, and he's holding a contest, and the theme of that contest is the soundtrack of your life, which is where you pick 7 or up to 10 albums that kind of serve as the soundtrack of your life, which take you to a certain place or make you remember certain people. So I'm entering, and I've pulled 8 albums, and I'm going to show them to you and kind of tell you what they mean to me and why I love them so much. I kind of put them in chronological order, not by their release year, but chronological of my life. And the first 2 kind of fall under the same period of when I was very, very little. When I was growing up, my mom loved soul music, Motown, all of that kind of type of music. And my dad loved Johnny Cash and George Jones and a lot of the old school country guys. For me, when I was a little kid, I fell more under my mom's taste in music than my dad's. I'm not a huge country fan, but I did listen around to what my mom was playing, basically because I was a little kid and I had no choice. But I got to really like this music, and the first album that I'm going to show, and 6 of these 8 albums come from what I call my original collection, quote, meaning that this was from the time when vinyl was still the dominant format for music, and cassettes were around, and this is before CDs and before the time when I switched over to CDs, basically because I had no choice. But before I got back into vinyl collecting, which was in 2011, I always had a group of records with me that I took from place to place where I lived. So I kind of refer to that as my original collection. And these first 2 were actually my mom's actual records. They're not very playable anymore. In fact, they're in horrible condition, but I keep them anyway just for sentimentality. But Al Green's Let's Stay Together is the first album I'm going to show for this. This album was played endlessly, and of course I love Al Green. He's got to be one of the smoothest, sweetest sounding singers ever. And Let's Stay Together, the song, is an all-time classic. But yeah, my mom played this endlessly, and I'm kind of using this album as a representative of like a whole group, like Barry White. She had a lot of Barry White albums. She had the Shaft soundtrack. She had, a lot of soul and 70s, early 70s soul music. So I'm using this as kind of the representative of that whole group. So and anytime I hear Let's Stay Together, these days it reminds me of the Pulp Fiction soundtrack a little bit, but mostly it reminds me of the time when I was a real little kid and listening to my mom as she was playing this and dancing around to it. So this is album number 1. The second album also falls under that category. This is from my original collection. This is actually one that my mom bought. And it's also not very playable because I tried cleaning these records and they didn't really come very clean, and it doesn't sound very good. But the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. I grew up with this album. I was probably 7 or 8 years old when Saturday Night Fever came out. I remember seeing it in the theater, and I remember my mom buying this album. This is the actual album from the 70s, and it got played so many times that this all at least all of the Bee Gees tracks and a few others are imprinted on my brain. So I know it's a little cheesy. I don't care. I can listen to this and be happy almost any time. But this reminds me of the late 70s, and it seems like this is also kind of interlinked with the first Star Wars movie because I remember being obsessed with Star Wars and trying to get as many of the action figures and toys as I could, and this music always seemed to be in the background. So this is my second album, the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. Moving up into the 80s, the early 80s, I first saw this group, actually this duo, on Solid Gold. If any of you remember that show, who are of a certain age. And aside from the Solid Gold dancers, which were very easy to look at and obsess over, a lot of the music affected me too. And I remember seeing these guys for the first time playing Kiss on My List. So when this album came out, which I believe was in '83, it's Hall & Oates Rock and Soul Part 1, which is their greatest hits collection. I had to have it. So this was actually the very first album that I got, that I picked, and it was a Christmas present in 1983. So, yeah. I'm a big fan of Hall & Oates, especially this period. I know they had a few hits in the 70s, but they really broke open in the 80s, and I was obsessed with their music, and I can still put any of their songs on from this album and be perfectly happy. And it reminds me of the Christmas in 1983 when actually this stereo system, if I'm pointing to it right, that you see right here, these three silver units, was also bought that same Christmas. So this was actually the first record played on the stereo, which I eventually inherited. So this album kind of has a multiple meanings for me, aside from being a huge Hall & Oates fan. So this is album number 3 for me. The next one, probably more than any other album in the early 80s to mid 80s that is really speaks to a certain time period, which for me in this case is the summer of '84. Was that summer where I'd just graduated high school, not high school, junior high, and I was about to start high school that fall. So it was that summer in between the two, and this album came out, and it was in heavy rotation on just about every radio station I tuned into. It's one of those albums where almost every song was released as a single, and even though the production is a little dated, it kind of has that 80s drum sound on a lot of the tracks. It's still an all-time classic album. Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen. This is also, I bought this that summer, probably a week or two after this came out, and played it over and over and over. This album is still in decent shape. It kind of is one of the survivors from my original collection that I didn't totally trash. And it just reminds me of that sense of freedom you have when you're on summer vacation and you're about to start a whole new era of your life, being high school, and you're kind of just hanging in that limbo area and just having as much fun as you can. And this album was the soundtrack for 1984 easily for me, but also as big part of my life too. And I'm a huge Springsteen fan, and this one more than any other because this came out at a time where when it was actually new, and it was kind of like an album that I could claim compared to the stuff that he had in the 70s, which I was obviously too little to own or listen to. But I went back, of course, and filled in all of the gaps in my Springsteen collection. But for 1984, this is the album for me. So there's that. This next one always reminds me of a time in the later 80s, probably 85, 86, 87, when the classic rock radio station, right around the time when classic rock was becoming a radio format, they would play on Sunday nights, they would play 6 whole albums in a row with hardly any commercials. It would be just basically long enough for a side to finish. The DJ would come on and tell you what you were listening to and what the songs were, and then go right to the next side. It was a taper's dream. It was one of the ways that I filled in my music collection for just the cost of a blank cassette, and I would obsessively tune in every Sunday to see what was being played and which albums I wanted, and I would just be hanging over the record button waiting for the music to start and getting the entire thing with no interruptions. So even though this is a 70s album, every time I see Eat a Peach or listen to it, it reminds me of that time when I was just a poor kid, had very little money, couldn't really afford to buy very many albums myself. And it was called the 106 pack. It was on, I live in Chicago, so it's 105.9 FM, WCKG. That station is no longer around, but it was called the 106 pack. And usually they would do one double album per week, and among the others. And I remember hearing that Eat a Peach was going to be one of the albums, and I still feel that excitement every time I listen to it, especially the first side of just hitting that button, that record button on my tape player, and just getting the whole album. So even though this is early 70s, for me, I didn't get to really listen to it until the mid to late 80s. So the Allman Brothers' Eat a Peach reminds me of that time of recording albums and writing all the tracks down and keeping them organized. And it was like the beginning of my musical obsession, I guess you could say, among other things. So yeah, so Eat a Peach really symbolizes that for me. I got 2 more albums to go. Let me take a quick drink of water. And this album also started an obsession for this band. It was one of those things that it was one of those super mega albums. I know what I'm showing is probably not, the rare or unusual stuff, but if we're talking, a suburban kid in the 80s, so but when this band really broke big, I bought this album. It's still my original copy, still sounds good, and it really was kind of the soundtrack for my junior year in high school. It's Joshua Tree by U2. Yeah, this album came out, and I first heard With or Without You, and I became obsessed, and I wound up getting War and The Unforgettable Fire and whatever else I could get my hands on at the time, and just became a total fan of U2. And like I said, as far as junior year goes, this was the album for me. So, yeah, U2's The Joshua Tree. And this last one, no, I'm sorry, I have two more besides this. Never mind. This last one that I guess would symbolize my school years. In this case, it would be college. I remember hearing this band a lot when I was in college in the spring of 1991, and I was hanging out a lot with the woman who would become my future wife 20 years later, which is another whole video I could make about that. But I listened to this band a lot. They were played on the radio a lot, and it reminds me of that spring in 1991 when I was madly in love with this woman. I had asked her to marry me back then, and she turned me down. And I would ask her 20 years later, and she would say yes, and we're still married, and I've been the happiest I've ever been in my life. So, Crowded House, Woodface, was played a lot on WXRT, which it's still around, but it's kind of the shadow of its former self. But a lot of songs from this album were played on the radio. I had this on cassette originally, and when I got back into vinyl, this was one of my grail records for a while until I finally tracked it down. I love just about every song on this album. It's a perfect pop album on its own, but hearing a lot of these songs reminds me of that time when I thought I knew it all, I guess you could say, being a cocky 21-year-old at the time, I think, 21-year-old, and I was madly in love, and I was working my butt off at school, and it just, anytime I hear a song off of this album, it just reminds me of that, and it's probably one of the happiest times of my life. So yeah, Crowded House, Woodface is one of the key albums of my collection, and would probably be one of the key albums if I did a soundtrack of my life, which is kind of what I'm doing now. And the last album, I kind of picked because it was one of the first CDs that I ever bought. When the time came in the late 80s, like 1988, 89, when record stores were kind of split at the time between vinyl and CD, and the cassettes were always against the wall. Probably around like 1989 or so, that changed big time. It became 75-80% CDs, and the vinyl got pushed back into the corner, and nobody was buying it anymore. And I made the switch in 1988. I got my first CD player, and I picked this album because it was a super group, and it had probably 5 of my favorite musicians ever. And kind of as a little dedication to Tom Petty, who just passed, I have to put in the first album by the Traveling Wilburys. I ended up buying this again at the greatest estate sale I've ever been to, which could easily be a video of its own. But yeah, Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 was one of the first CDs I ever bought. Actually, I got 3 CDs with my CD player. I bought this, Fleetwood Mac's Greatest Hits, and Steve Winwood's Roll With It. Those were my first 3 CDs. So basically, anytime I hear a Traveling Wilburys song off of this album, it reminds me of that giant black CD player. It was just a monstrosity. And yeah, it's a shame. You've got George, Roy, and now Tom are gone. It's very sad. I mean, and this is a great album. I mean, it's fun. You know, you could tell these guys were enjoying themselves. They were just playing and not trying to make a grand artistic statement. They were just playing good music, enjoying each other's company, and yeah. So I'll cut it off here. Geez, thank you for making it this far. It's 21 minutes. So there you go. There's my entry into the Soundtrack of Your Life contest by Tales of the Crate. Hopefully, if I win, great. If not, hopefully I've made a new friend in the VC, which is always worth more than any record. So I'm going to cut it here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for liking and subscribing. And I'll see you soon. Peace.